Now we'll be talking about euthanasia, otherwise known as mercy killing or assisted suicide or assisted death or compassionate removal of potentially life-prolonging, life-saving, or life-sustaining measures, an action that would, of course, lead to death. So that's what we're talking about. And of course, the reason why we're talking about it is because every time young pastoral care or religious care trainees, like, members of healthcare ministry or young seminarians or nuns in training or pastors, and they sit down and they talk to a hospice person or an end-of-life care or palliative person or a medical ethicist, guaranteed someone will ask about euthanasia as if they're asking an expert about it. So my first suggestion to you guys is, why are you asking us? You should be the one telling us what you think. Because if you look through the entire course of the healthcare professions, like if you look through the curriculum of medicine or nursing or psychology or psychiatry or whatnot, there's nothing in there that will tell you that we're experts or trying to figure out what's good or what's bad or what's right or what's wrong. If you actually look at us when we were students, we don't even pay attention to those things because our minds are gradually being molded, focused, and fixated, maybe brainwashed, hopefully not, on the idea that the most important thing is to try to figure out the drugs, the tests, and the interventions and procedures that we can do if someone is sick and getting worse, right? So a very materialistic kind of thing. And it's also a very secular kind of thing because nothing in there speaks of religion or spirituality. Actually, just a few decades ago, you dial it back 1970s when medical science and technology is like, people are looking up to it as if it's a Star Trek solution to everything or a Star Wars solution to everything. Nobody really talks about spirituality. It's like a non-scientific, ancient, outdated kind of thinking. So going back to what I just said, you should be the one telling us, especially if you're talking to a healthcare provider or a doctor or a nurse who's actually part of your church or part of the same body of Christ that you're part of, and you're supposed to be the future leaders, priests, and people who would provide guidance to them, right? So, but anyway, the reason why you're asking, or the reason why a lot of people are asking, is because you're not exposed to a lot of it. It's so difficult for trainees in the religious or spiritual care or pastoral care, Christian pastoral care field to actually have a lot of experience or exposure inside the hospital dealing with very sick or dying patients and their families during the course of their training years. So everything sounds somewhat foreign to you. And so that's the first thing you ask, because it's very intriguing and it's very important. It's like someone who's dying. Why and how, and is it okay for you to stop doing anything or remove the stuff that you're doing? So that's the big question. So my advice is actually for you to sit down, think about it, pray about it, and meditate about it yourself. And what I can tell you is, if the situation is there's a family or there's a patient who's part of your church or who asked for you, same religious belief system, and then they're being asked if they're okay with not starting a life-sustaining measure like, feeding, and the patient cannot eat, and so is it okay to put a tube so that the patient can eat? Or the patient cannot breathe, he might get better or he might not, but the only thing that will keep him alert and alive and sustain him for several weeks or a few months to assist with the respiration, is it okay not to give it? Or is it okay to stop it, especially if the patient is already incompetent, not able to tell you what he or she likes? Okay, so meaning the family is asking for it, or the doctors are trying to decide with the family whether it's okay, it's right, it's good, it's ethical, or it's moral not to sustain the life, or to do something or not do something that will ultimately end the person's life. And that's pretty much what euthanasia is. In the old days, everybody says euthanasia in the same breath as mercy killing, because that's pretty much what it is. Somebody's lying down there suffering a lot, close to death, and you can't do anything about it. So hopelessly, irreversibly sick, probably progressively getting worse or injured, is it okay to end their life? So mercy killing, you're doing it out of mercy. Now, nobody uses mercy anymore, because when you say mercy and you think euthanasia, people think mercy killing, and nobody wants that phrase, especially if they're pushing for a law or a policy that would make it acceptable, right? So right now, the fad term is compassionate. Compassionate. Of course, you don't use killing, because killing is, even if you say compassionate killing, doesn't sound good. So compassionate removal of or compassionate withholding of, or compassionate somethings. That's one way of doing it. The other word they use is dignity. Anyway, sit down and try to figure out whether it's good or bad. Not doing something to try to save the person or try to extend the life of the person, or doing something that would shorten the life of the person or end the person's life. You can certainly tell the patient or the family who's in front of you the stuff your professors or one or two of your professors, more than likely if you go to Bible school or the seminary, not all professors would have the same opinion, right? So you'll probably agree with one or two, and then you sit down and then just tell them what you can remember out of your seminary book or Bible study textbook or your lecture notes. But my suggestion is it's not going to be very effective, because it's not just a matter of mouthing out what you remember out of your training days, because they'll keep on asking you, and they're very sensitive about the entire situation, right? Remember, this is a very sensitive, very emotional, very serious situation. The person in front of you is about to die. The family is about to lose a very special person, a loved one. They're being asked to do something that seems wrong to them. That's why they asked for you. It seems sinful as far as they're concerned. That's why they're asking for you. And it's about doing something or not doing something that would end their loved one's life. Okay, so what would you do? Now, if you just mouth out the stuff and then they'll say something like, how come? Why so? What about this? What about that? Then you're stuck, because your lecture notes and your textbook won't cover those things, right? So it's a very personal answer. So meaning your answer has to come from the heart, or you might say from the spirit, for it to be effective, right? You should actually sincerely believe what you're saying and not just tell them what you remember from your training years, right? So this is actually same with medicine. Doctors can mouth out all sorts of things if they're attempting some form of basic beginner level counseling, which is the most that they can do, because 95% of their training is geared towards something else that's not psychosocial, but it's not going to be effective. The only thing that's effective is their empathy and sincerity and compassion, and you actually believe what you're saying, right? So my suggestion is you sit down and try to figure things out. Now, I'm not a Bible study or a seminary trainer or supervisor or professor, or I'm not a trainer in healthcare ministry school, so I cannot tell you what gives. But personally, my suggestion is just go to the basic stuff. Just go back to the basic ideas. Look through the scriptures. You can look through the Old Testament and the New Testament. But what I can tell you, at first glance, it looks like nothing in there is saying that it's okay to think about ending people's life or not doing anything to someone who's suffering, miserable, and near death. Nothing in there, right? But then, of course, you can. The doctors who are pushing for it will say the argument is, well, there's a lot of killing in the Old Testament, and it seems like God agrees with it. As far as I'm concerned, that's the key word. It's only okay if it's God's will or if God orders it. Now, if you move to the New Testament, even more. You can't really see any indication that it's okay, right? And as of now, I don't think there's any clear word from God or from above that it's okay to kill. Now, there's also no indication that it's okay to not do anything to care for a person who's very sick, suffering, and dying, or very injured. There's also no indication that it's okay. As far as I know, Christ or his apostles or disciples didn't do anything or show anything that we can use to justify the idea of euthanasia. Active, meaning we did something to kill the person, or passive, we withheld doing something that would have prolonged or preserved the life of the person. Nothing in their actions and the way they thought would justify that at first glance, right? Well, anyway, that's as far as I'll go, because, that's not my field, but that's my 2 cents worth. Now, things become complicated. It might be very similar to medicine when we talk about ethics. Things become complicated when we take out the basic obvious stuff, and then we try to come up with ways to argue that it's okay. And then we go into philosophy, and then we can say something like, if it was euthanasia, we can say something like, assuming that it wasn't that clear that it's bad or it's sinful or evil, assuming it wasn't that, can we come up with another reason why it's okay? So you start out with other presuppositions or assumptions, and then you try to reason things out. That's why you have like pages worth of debates or conferences or lectures or treatises, because that you can do that for decades and you won't arrive at a decent answer, right? So that's the reason why it's a revealed truth. If you actually get invited to a conference on ethics about euthanasia, that's probably what will happen. You'll hear people trying to come up with nice, sophisticated arguments for it or against it. Now, if you just stick to your basic belief, the very secular university, med school, or healthcare university will find you very boring. So next time they won't invite you, they'll invite somebody else or some other pastor person or Christian professor person who's willing to play around with their ideas to make it interesting, right? Or they'll invite you, but they'll invite a whole bunch of other people like Buddhists, or just to tell everyone, this guy has his own belief and this other three people have their own belief. They're kind of the same. And then the finale would be the doctor telling everyone this is our consensus based on what we think, and the superstar of the show. And of course, if that was the case, my suggestion is not to accept the invitation to go there. Well, actually, if you're brave enough and you feel like there's like 5% or 10% of young minds in the audience that you can actually save, then maybe it's worth going through the entire ordeal. But, just be aware of what you're entering. It's not an environment full of sheep in sheep's clothing. It's the other one in sheep's clothing, right? So anyway, if you do decide to accept the invitation and you are willing to play the game, okay, and you're in front of this meeting or discussion, could be 10 people or 20 people, or it could be an actual conference, and you're talking there, and there's also this medical ethicist with a very secular kind of upbringing. Of course, you're in a very secular environment if it's a modern university, right? You can have another philosopher who doesn't believe in your belief system. You can have a whole bunch of doctors who are quietly laughing at what you're saying. Providers with hardened hearts. The older you get, the more hardened your heart is, if that's what you've been cultivating earlier on in your life, right? If that's what you've been, especially if you've been exposed to the same thing over and over again in your life. So you have providers with more or less hardened hearts, meaning, the conscience is not there and the belief system is really practically gone as far as you're concerned. They're probably still members of your church, and they think going to church will get them anywhere, regardless of how they think about ending people's lives or such. And doing a medical mission or two or donating to the church is good enough. Of course, it's not completely their fault. Some churches actually make people think that, especially when they ask for donations and funds, and then, by doing so, you're actually helping the church or the body of Christ. But we won't go there. So if you're there, then these are the kind of secular, non-religious, non-Christian arguments that you may hear. Well, first of all, let's look at a very familiar story. Most of us have memorized in childhood, or at least the basic story. Okay, so it's a story about a traveler who got stripped of all his clothing, beaten to death, and then left half dead. So that's like, someone that you can do mercy killing or euthanasia on. The traveler is there on the road, so you have a person who's not part of your healthcare profession class. Could be anyone. Could be like, someone from a low socioeconomic class, and he's like a charity patient, or someone who's not as smart as you, not a medical person, or not a well-educated healthcare professional, was robbed, stripped of his clothing, beaten, and left half dead. So like very injured. That's the kind of person you can do mercy killing on, right? So someone who's very sick, very close to death, or very injured, right? Like it's almost someone who got brought into the hospital emergency room who's like that. So now, and then two people passed by. So if it was the Jewish temple, it would be the big shots, the one who's very smart, tells everyone what's good or what's bad. That would be like the priest or the boss of the temple. He would know what's okay, right? So he's the boss. And then you have another lesser but still a big shot, the Levite, very big positions in the religious field or in the temple and in the political field, and almost like the boss priests, right? Now, of course, if it's the temple of modern medicine, you'll probably think of the big bosses, the smart people or the experts of the healthcare university temple, and the other Levite looking people just waiting to be the big boss or with big positions themselves, and that would be the Levite of the modern secular university or modern secular medical institutions, like the educational institutions or the healthcare institution, right? Now, what's curious is about the story is Christ says they looked at the guy and they decided not to help him. He's not worth their effort and time. Okay, so that's pretty much the idea. Now, obviously, the traveler is not a Jewish priest or a Levite, because I'm guessing if it was a Jewish priest or Levite, the story will probably end up with the two people helping this person out, because they're part of the group and they're important people. Of course, people come up with all sorts of explanations, but this is a story provided to very simple folk, and all the fancy other explanations won't enter their mind. Like, maybe they thought the person is already dead and it's they'll become unclean or whatnot. The thing that's glaring is they decided not to help, right? And that's pretty much, I think, what the story is all about. And then a Samaritan, somebody who's not a big shot priest, head of the temple, or a big shot political or Levite, a political person. In healthcare professions, political would be like, heads of the academic groups or societies or academies or like big institutions. That would be the Levite, or also with some religious positions. So obviously the Samaritan is not like that. It's like a low-lying fruit or low-lying person, probably like a medical student or a clerk or a first year or second year nursing trainee, or it's like a nurse assistant doing the scut work. So that's pretty much the idea in the story. So someone who's not up there, and that person actually was the one who cared enough to help the traveler, the one who's been robbed, beaten, and left half dead, almost close to death, and obviously needing help and suffering a lot, And then the question is, who's the good guy, right? Who is my neighbor? So that's the question. Who is my neighbor? And then, of course, the teaching is, if you see the least of your brethren, or the least of my brethren, there I am in them, right? So if you help them, you're helping me. That's the other teaching. So, and then the answer to who is my neighbor would be this Samaritan guy, or this non-big shot guy, right? So now, as far as euthanasia is concerned, so the argument that you might hear is, what are the reasons that this big shot temple priest guys or Levite persons, what are the reasons that they would give to justify not doing anything to try to save the life or to try to help the poor traveler? Okay, so one reason that you'll hear is, well, he's not worth saving. Well, obviously he's not worth saving. Why? Because, he's already half dead. He's not like a normal person who he's still healthy. He's half dead. He's very sick. He's half dead. But that's not good enough, right? They'll say something like, well, the suffering is too much and we cannot control the suffering, or the quality of life is too bad, and therefore he's not the kind of person the scriptures are talking about. We can end the life of this kind of person. And then your initial reaction would be, yeah, you're right, it's suffering a lot, it's a good thing, let's end the suffering. But my suggestion is, don't fall for the bait, don't fall for the trap. That's a bait, so don't fall for it. The first thing you have to realize is, when doctors talk about suffering and quality of life, your idea, the thing inside your head about suffering and quality of life, is different from the thing inside their head about suffering and quality of life. So in medical rounds and conferences of the healthcare providers, nurses, or doctors, or like team rounds, when somebody says, is the patient suffering? What you'll hear is probably, well, the pain is still there. It's pretty bad. It's like 5/10. You'll hear something, or you'll hear tools about the pain and the throwing up and things like that. And more than half the time, or most of the time, nobody talks about spiritual suffering or anything along those lines. Sometimes they might attempt to talk about depression or anxiety along the psychiatry lines, but only briefly, because the thing with doctors, especially if you're not psychologists or psychiatrists by training, they don't like that stuff. So most of them are not too interested in the mood and the depression, and that's like a really murky area as far as they're concerned. So what will probably happen is, some trainee or resident or nurse will say, well, he's still feeling sad or depressed, and then the answer is, go and get the psychiatrist or go and get the psychologists, and that's pretty much it, or go get them counseling, and that's the end of the story. Now, if they treat depression and anxiety and fear and things like that way, then how much do you think they would treat your issue, the spiritual suffering part, or the spiritual distress? Practically none. You'll be lucky if they think about it and they say something like, let's call the spiritual care provider of this person, or let's call for spiritual caring or spiritual counseling or spiritual guide. You'll be lucky if they actually said it, right? So that's pretty much it. And then where does euthanasia come in? Well, they meet and then they talk about that, and everything seems controlled or not too controlled, but then the patient's really feeling bad already and the patient cannot cope. And so the decision is made, well, ask him if he wants to die already, because that's as far as we can go. And that's where the mercy killing assisted suicide because the patient will say, I want to die, and then you assist the patient. So that's like assisted suicide, or the assisted killing, or the assisted suicide, or euthanasia will come in, right? Now, what's the problem with that? So that's the suffering as far as the other secular folks are concerned. Now, your suffering is different. Actually, as far as your belief system is concerned, suffering is not completely wrong. It's not even evil. If you actually walk the path of Christ, which you should, it's guaranteed to be filled with suffering. I mean, that's what they teach us in grade school Bible study, and I think it's pretty true. I mean, you know that. Now, what I can tell you is a lot of the professionals think that's rubbish and don't think that's the case. Like, you're not Christ, you're not the apostles, you're not a disciple, and we're already saved. Why should we do that? We're not willing to let go of the fancy cars and the fancy lifestyle and the trips abroad and the hotel conferences. We're not willing to let go of all those material things. So we don't need to, because we're helping people who are sick. That will surely get us to heaven. Of course, your answer to that is no, it won't. You go there, they look at your heart, and they'll see something really hardened, almost as hard as the heart of the Pharaoh who went after Moses, right? So that's the suffering idea. Your idea of suffering is different from their idea of suffering. Quality of life is the same thing. Quality of life, as far as they're concerned, is different from your idea of a good quality Christian life. Now, we actually have tools to measure quality of life, and if you actually look at the tools, it's the same thing. You have a whole bunch of parameters and numbers asking about, is the pain okay, is the throwing up okay, is the headache fine, and then you have a few numbers, maybe 2 or 3 about depressed mood or anxious, compared to like a dozen or more along the physical, distressing, suffering stuff. And you're lucky if you have one number about spirituality or spiritual distress, or maybe not. Some tools don't even have those. The thought process in the secular mind is, if you have those, then you'll be depressed. So all we need to ask about is the mood and things like that. We don't need to ask about all those crazy other religious, metaphysical, existential, or spiritual stuff. That's a different thing. Just let the priest or the pastor pray in front, and then that's the end of whatever they need to do, which we don't really believe in. If it's a secular, irreligious, or non-Christian environment, and most of your modern institutions are like that, okay, so they're different. So you have to realize that. You don't just say, you're right, you're so good, you're ending suffering, and that quality of life is not good. Realize when they say stuff like that, and even more, like even dignity, all those nice sounding stuff, the thing in their head is different from the thing in your head or in your belief system. The thing in their head should not be the thing in your head, and it's different from those things as defined by your belief system, your Christian belief system. Be aware of that. Now, another question you have to ask yourself is, what if you have a person surrounded by his or her family, and everyone in a very non-religious, non-Christian, very secular perspective thinks, well, it's not worth preserving this person's life. It's not worth sustaining this person's life. But the person you can still talk to the person. So that's the worst kind of euthanasia, of course. What if you were actually given a chance to be there, preferably several weeks or several days before they thought of it, and then you were given several more hours or several more weeks with the person who had been in the hospital, very sick, with no contact with anyone religious, every day faced with the same perspective, like, are you throwing up? Are you in pain? Do you want to end your life? Quality of life is poor. Do you think we should end the life of your mom? You should answer for her. She cannot answer for herself. Maybe you should agree with that. You're prolonging the suffering. You're bombarded with that. If you're the family member, or if you're the person inside the hospital, you're constantly bombarded with that. And there's absolutely no pastor or priest or none that you can talk to seriously. Now, maybe there's one person who's overworked, and the most that person can do is, hi, how are you doing? Do you have anything to ask me? And, of course, you'll be shy or embarrassed to ask that person. And that's the only whiff of your belief system or spirituality or religion that you desperately need. That's the only whiff that you got. Now, would it make a lot of difference if you, the pastor or the priest or the healthcare minister or the Christian pastoral care minister or the nun, you were given a chance to be with this person longer? Would it make a difference? Now, if your answer is yes, then that's what you're going to take away from this family and from this patient by ending this person's life in that kind of environment, in that kind of setting, right? Something to think about. Now, of course, I know that euthanasia is a very serious matter. I mean, it's not even legal in most places. And if it became legal in most countries, especially Western countries, which still has core Christianity-based value system, although they don't realize that. That's why they're going bonkers right now. I mean, all sorts of crazy things are happening right now, but it's a big thing. Like, even inside your own religious institutions or your churches, your leaders or your professors or your bishops or cardinals or whatnot are arguing about it. There can be times that, the bishops or cardinals or the Christian thinkers of one Western country, like, let's say United States, because I knew that happened. Bishops or cardinals don't agree with the Vatican or the head church in Europe or someplace else. Or like you'll have like 5 different people, different churches or different churches from different countries disagreeing with each other. And this becomes more controversial when you start talking about people who are not yet completely dead, like vegetative. A vegetative person is practically alive as long as you keep on feeding them, and they're not on a ventilator most of the time. So is it okay not to feed them so that they die, or is it okay to give them something so that they die? That's a big deal, right? So people who are not brain dead, like practically alive, you cannot define them as dead. Is that okay? Now, of course, the abortion issue is like a really bad thing, but it follows along the same kind of reasoning. The secular mind will try to reason out that that baby inside the mom's womb is not yet a real person. So, and they come up with all sorts of justifications for it or reasons for it. Like, there's no heartbeat. If you're an adult, you're 20-year-old, you're walking around, your heart stops, you're dead, right? So maybe that's a good idea. So they started talking about heartbeats. Of course, not everyone were stupid enough to buy the idea, but so when can we detect the heartbeat? Okay, let's set this number of weeks. Before this, the baby is not a person. And the problem is, what are you using? Well, you're using a 1970s contraption. Now 1980s, 1990s comes in, and now you have a better machine. And you realize those babies actually have heartbeats or heart activity several weeks before the time you thought. So 1 decade ago. So does that mean you actually killed a whole bunch of babies for the past 10 years? Okay, so it's a moving target, right? So is that okay with you? Like, well, the patient is very sick. How sick is sick enough? The patient is near death. How close to death do you have to be? Are you supposed to have 1 week left? Or is it okay if you're brain dead? Like, you're not going to die unless somebody switches off your ventilator, but you're brain dead. And, a dead brain is a dead person. Of course, that's controversial. The heart is still working. So it's not a heartbeat kind of thing. It's a brain kind of thing. Or is it okay if you're vegetative? There's still brain activity, but you're just sitting there looking at the wall. You're almost dead looking, but you're still alive. Is that okay? Or what about somebody who's still alive, but hooked on a ventilator? Look at the quality of life, they'll say. Or, he doesn't want to live like that. He wants us to end his life. Maybe we should do him a favor. And that's actually suicide. So like assisted suicide. But nobody's going to call it assisted suicide because it sounds terribly bad. It carries a lot of connotation. So they'll call it with some kind of compassionate stopping of this, or compassionate withholding of this, or compassionate, they won't say killing, but is it okay to do that? So where do you draw the line? So that you get into all sorts of trouble and problems and mess if you start talking about a group of people, especially medical or healthcare professionals or allegedly smart scholars, trying to decide among themselves through consensus. Of course, there's no objective way to figure it out, but through consensus, when life begins, or how dead is dead enough, or how close to death is close enough, or how poor quality is poor quality enough. So something to think about. We'll probably end there for now.